Hello, everybody, and welcome to ALOUD. Thank you for being here. I'm Jessica Strand, the Director of Public Programs here at the Library Foundation. Thank you. And I do this because if you're not aware of what the Library Foundation does, because you haven't been here before, I want to familiarize you with what we do. So we raise funds to support critical programs at the LAPL, programs which include Read Baby Read, adult literacy, Tech to Go, and Tech to Go gives anyone with a library card the ability to check out a Chromebook and a hotspot. And these programs and others are available to help all Angelinos across this vast city. So as we move into our third month, I was thinking about this, of live programs, I want to thank all of you for being here and all those who have come more than once. Thank you so much. It's hard to kind of go from 2 years of being virtual to then live again. But tonight, our guest writer, Tom Perrotta, and producer, Albert Berger, will discuss Perrotta's new novel, Tracy Flick Can't Win, as well as their collaboration on multiple projects. I won't talk about the novel. I'll let them do it. But I did find this really interesting, fun quote from the Washington Post's review of the book, and I thought I'd just read that. So here's a quote. How many fictional characters can say they've starred in a hit film, been profiled by the Washington Post, and lent their name to an enduring pop culture archetype? As far as we know, just one, Tracy Flick, the hyper-competent heroine of Tom Perrotta's Election, published in 1998, then lodged into the culture by 1999 film adaptation starring Reese Witherspoon. Election launched the driven high school Tracy Flick into public consciousness, where she came to symbolize utter certitude, not servitude, complete lack of self-awareness, and mindless ambition. End of quote. Now Perrotta gives us a new Tracy Flick, older, wiser, and pondering the realities of life, that little goes as planned. Now, without further ado, let me introduce tonight's guest. So Tom Perrotta is a best-selling author of 9 works of fiction, including Election and Little Children, both of which were made into nominated films. I can't believe I do this. I write this, and both of which were made into Oscar-nominated films. If they were just nominated for what, you're wondering? Anyway, The Leftovers, which was adapted into a critically acclaimed Peabody Award-winning HBO series. His work has been translated into many languages. Albert Berger formed Bonafide Productions with Ron Yerxa in 1992. Their producing credits include King of the Hill, Election, Cold Mountain, Little Children, Little Miss Sunshine, and Nebraska. They've done so many films that I had to cut some out. Their most recent film, Somewhere in Queens, starring Ray Romano and Laurie Metcalf, just premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival a couple of weeks ago. Berger also executive produced the award-winning documentary Crumb, and along with Yerxa, executive produced the Wilco documentary, I Am Trying to Break Your Heart, and the Levon Helm documentary, Ain't In It for My Health, and they also co-executive produced the HBO series The Leftovers. Please welcome Tom Perrotta and Albert Berger. Thank you.
Hello. How was your flight?
Well, I got to watch the January 6th hearings live, and so my blood pressure was was sky high.
Yeah, this was an exciting day for that. And how's the book tour been going?
I wish I was funny that this would be. You're setting me up good. It's weird to be back on tour and seeing people in the flesh. I'm so glad you came, actually, because some of my experiences in bookstores lately have been that crowds are sparse and that people are still a little anxious about coming out. So it's, I'm just really happy to see everyone here.
Yeah, me too. Just to get a feeling for the room, how many people have read the book, Tracy Flick Can't Win? Okay, good. You're in for a treat when you get it, and I think there's some here. But I guess I wanted to start this off by asking you about your process in general. You've often told me that when you sit down to write a novel, you don't map it out at all, which seems absolutely terrifying. You start to write, maybe you have a character in mind or something, and you see where it goes, and all of a sudden it starts to gel eventually. And I wondered about this particular one. I'd read somewhere that Vito was the center of your focus, and that somehow Tracy elbowed her way into this. How did that work?
Yeah, so for a long time, I thought I was writing a book called Hall of Fame, which was about a high school that starts a Hall of Fame, and they invite one of their all-time great football heroes to be the first person inducted. And it's a character in this book named Vito Falcone. Vito is a guy in his 40s. He had an undistinguished career with the Miami Dolphins, but he's become a sort of legendary high school football coach. And unfortunately, he's starting to experience neurological symptoms that he thinks are related to concussions he got while playing. And I thought, Vito comes back to his hometown to be honored, but really what happens when he gets there is that he's confronted with all these people who have unfinished business with him, who he mistreated when he was young and on top of the world. And it seemed to me like a really great image of like where masculinity is in the culture right now. Like we had our great run, we men, and now we're all banged up and everybody's, wants to tell us what assholes we were. And
we can't even remember in Vito's case what he did.
Yeah. No, right. And so I started to tell this story of Vito, and I found myself writing it as if it were Election, which has a very distinctive structure. It's multiple narrators who tell the story in little bite-sized chapters. And I felt like, why am I, copying the style of this novel that I wrote almost 30 years ago? But I couldn't write it any other way. And then at some point, I suddenly just had this little glimmer of like, oh, is Tracy Flick in this high school? Because the football hero is Tracy's nemesis. Like that's her shorthand for unfair male privilege. The guy she can't compete with because there's no playing field that they can, face each other in a fair way. And once I realized that Tracy was there, and see, I say that in that word of like realized or discovered, rather than I put Tracy there. It when a novel's working, it feels more like there's this thing out there, and you're, glimpsing it vaguely and trying to, feel your way into it. So that was like the great discovery. It was, oh, Tracy is here, and then suddenly the novel has two centers of gravity, and it has some tension and conflict. You always need that second idea, and Tracy was the second idea, not the first.
Interesting. You brought up the form of the novel, and that was interesting as well because you had kind of section headings, and then there were the various characters. There's many characters in this novel, and you kind of tell it first person from their various perspectives, yet Vito's is a third person. And also that, then all of a sudden there's these recommendation letters for the Hall of Fame. How did you figure out the form of it?
Yeah, so, as I said before, I was writing, I started with the people who were, planning the Hall of Fame, and they were coming in the short first-person sections, and that wasn't working for Vito, and for some reason he worked better in third person. And that's something that's really my more comfortable mode, right? Like almost every novel I write is in third person. Little children, abstinence teacher, the Mrs. Fletcher parts of Mrs. Fletcher, though her son's parts were in first. So sometimes I go back and forth. But the way it broke down in the end was the people on the committee selecting the Hall of Fame are in first person. And so their deliberations come to you in first, and then the people who are being considered for the Hall of Fame come to you in third.
Can you talk about your influences as a writer, and maybe particularly with this novel? Are there anybody that comes to mind? Or, I mean, obviously it is reminiscent of Election in its form, but...
Yeah, well, I think the determining influence for me was, Raymond Carver in the 80s, because I think the influences that really form you are the ones that get you when you're young. And so, Carver wrote in a very simple, charged language about, working class people. And to me, like the real trick that he pulled, and it's something that really almost feels like an ethical thing to me, is the story. Anyone can read these stories, and anyone can get something from them. And I think, but then there's just underneath that surface that is unintimidating, there's some very sophisticated literary things that are happening. So if you taught in a class, you could talk about these stories, in great detail. And I grew up in the working class world, surrounded by people who didn't go to college, and I really just didn't want to write stories that I felt like, those people couldn't read, or felt like there was forbidding, or there were too much of an academic or artsy surface that they would feel alienated by it. But I also wanted to write something that had some literary depth to it. And so Carver, I think, was one of the writers. Hemingway also was doing that kind of thing. And you could see Carver as a sort of, continuation of a Hemingway tradition. I think Willa Cather fits in that. A book that a couple people have mentioned in relation to Tracy Flick Can't Win is Winesburg, Ohio.
Sherwood Anderson.
Which is a collection of stories all set in one town. And, people will wander in and out of other people's stories, but they're really about, these lonely, isolated individuals who are all living together in this one place. And this book has a little bit of that feeling.
Yeah, I guess Bad Haircut, your first collection of stories, has a little bit of, that small town and certain characters that emerge as well.
Yeah, I think Bad Haircut was very influenced by Tobias Wolff, who was also my grad school teacher, and I loved his way of telling really serious stories in a very funny voice. And so I think I felt much more of an obligation in Bad Haircut, or an aspiration to be funny. And I think Tracy Flick Can't Win has some comic energy to it, but it was not like the foremost mood in my mind when I was writing it.
Yeah, I mean, the connection to Carver and Wolff and all that is very clear in your work, and Hemingway, and the simple sentence structure, beautifully written things. But there's another side to what you do that I love, which is how you manage to work the world around you into your narratives. And that's something that I don't really see in a lot of their work, certainly not Carver. But, and I'm thinking of, like, for instance, The Abstinence Teacher with the culture wars, or the evangelical right encroaching into the suburbs, and or The Leftovers with the anxiety of 9/11. And this book is just filled with that, between Tracy and her Me Too memories, and glass ceiling that she's up against, or Nate and social media, or every one of the characters' concussion syndrome with Vito. Do you I mean, obviously, you're very engaged with the world around you. How do you approach your novels? Do you think, well, there's something I want to work in here, or is it more organic, or kind of a combination of both?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So when I wrote Election, I think I had in my mind this idea of, okay, I want to write a political novel, but I actually don't know a lot about politics, as it would play out in a national, in Congress or in a state legislature. But I was homeroom representative for 2 years. And it became sort of like once I had that feeling of like, oh, but I can still, you can talk about the Machiavellian nature of politics. You can talk about, crafting an image for a candidate. You can talk about, the sexual secrets that the characters are trying to hide from the voting public. And that was, that was such a liberating idea of like, oh, I could tell this, kind of a big story in a very small setting. And it sort of became, almost like a method for me to think of like, yeah, these stories are all about a very small world, like a senior center or a, middle school soccer team. But in my mind, they're a microcosm for America. And so in Tracy Flick Can't Win, Tracy is responding to this Me Too moment. It's causing her to remember the sexual relationship she had with a teacher when she was 15 years old, and she's rethinking that the way the whole culture was rethinking a lot of stuff, a lot of sexual politics that, we just kind of revised our thinking about. Vito, yes, is struggling with his post-concussion syndrome, but also just with, toxic masculinity in general. The Hall of Fame led to a lot of, just thinking about what does a culture honor? And so, now that led me to think about like the way that there's a whole new idea of fame. Tracy wanted fame in a very old school way. She wanted to run for office and get power that way, and she would be famous because she was, a legitimate public servant. But this young woman is an ASMR artist who does makeup tutorials on YouTube and gets, not huge, not millions of views, but hundreds of thousands of views, and she makes some money, and people are like, she's the most famous person who ever, after Vito, she's the most famous person who ever went to this school. And Tracy's just appalled by this because she doesn't want to honor some girl who like does videos where she whispers about cosmetics.
Taps her fingers.
And taps, yes. And so it's just, and then one of the young students who's on the committee is, she's like a young Chinese-American version of Tracy. There are a lot of echoes of Election in this book, but unlike Tracy, she's queer and she has a non-binary love interest in this story. And she is very focused on racial justice and the fact that all the Hall of Fame nominees are white people and straight people. So a lot of this stuff just emerged naturally from, my characters just reacting to the world around them and being themselves. And one of the reasons to go back to a character like Tracy Flick is that I think she contains so much social history in her. She Election, the book refers very explicitly to the 1992 election and the Clinton administration and some of the distinctive features of that. Hillary being a kind of equal partner to Bill and not being a traditionally feminine First Lady, but also Bill's sexual secrets and this thing called the character issue, which was, can you be unfaithful to your wife but somehow faithful to your constituents? And shouldn't you be honest about who you are in the world? You know, and those things have sort of, you know, because Tracy has remained in the public eye and the Clintons have remained in the public eye. I would almost say the whole 20-year period since election, the movie came out, was the Clinton era. Mm-hmm. Even Trump is a product of the Clinton era. It's hard to imagine Trump being elected if his opponent wasn't Hillary Clinton. And so I think, you know, she just turned out to be like a really interesting vehicle, I think, to talk about just vast cultural changes over the past 25 or 30 years.
Yeah, well, it's kind of fascinating and very exciting for my partner Ron Yerkes and I to be sort of part of all this because, of course, I think Election, your novel, and the movie are sort of inextricably tied together now in some kind of relationship or dialogue started by you. And, you know, it's very interesting to look back on your novel and see how you introduced Tracy and then how she changed in the movie. And then now in the new book, you know, it seems like you were in some ways affected by Reese's characterization of Tracy. Now it's kind of a weird combination because your Tracy was very naturalistic or very real. And in Election, her character was a little bit broader or something, but really caught the public's imagination. And now, you know, you really can detect her voice in the new Tracy, yet it's a lot of the qualities of the Tracy that you originally established. Can you talk about, you know, what you think is going on here between the movie and what an opportunity to pick up, you know, 25 years later, character and.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I mean, the first thing I will say, and this is credit to you and Ron and to Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor and to Reese. You know, Tracy Flick stayed in the culture because Reese Witherspoon, you know, made her incredibly vivid. You know, that was just an electric performance, and it was full of energy, and it was just, you know, undeniably great. And there were some changes, right? I mean, my Tracy Flick was a little more mature and sexually confident than the Tracy Flick that the film created. The Tracy Flick the film created, she's got, you know, precocious ambition, but she's a little more personally innocent and vulnerable. Though for some reason the adults around her don't see the vulnerability; they only see, you know, the precocious ambition and the ferocious potential. But I think you know, this happened. You know, I've been lucky enough to have a number of books adapted, and I will say that whenever an actor plays a character, I can never remember then what the character was in my head. You know, when I reflect on, you know, Sarah in Little Children, it's Kate Winslet that I'm seeing now. Because I don't even know what I'm seeing when it's just words on a page. It's some kind of dream image. I'm not seeing necessarily a movie in my head when I read. I think I'm just seeing like little fragments of images, I think. You know, just reacting to words on a page. But, you know, a visual image is so indelible in some way. So yes, I mean, when I was writing this book, I was often imagining Tracy's voice as Reese Witherspoon's voice. So it's now a very complicated chain of references. So Tracy Flick Can't Win. I think you could read it if you have not read Election. I think you could read it if you have only seen the movie of Election. You know, you don't have to go in any particular order. But I think if you do, there is this complicated chain because it's There's Tracy in the novel I wrote. There's Tracy in the film. And then there's the free-floating Tracy that, like, political journalists would use to apply to almost any ambitious young woman politician. And then there's sort of feminist Tracy. That was a kind of revision that happened about, in the last 5 or 10 years, where Tracy had been seen as a real comic villain when the movie came out. And I think rightly, various feminist critics started to say, wait a second, why is she the villain? She's a high school girl. She's 16 years old. She's trying to be elected president of her high school. The worst thing that she does is she tears down some posters and then denies it. She also was seduced by her English teacher, and now some other teacher is holding a grudge against her because that teacher got fired, rightly so. It was just a funny thing, I think, because the culture just sided with Matthew Broderick's, Mr. M's interpretation of Tracy. But right there in the book and in the film is Tracy's interpretation of Tracy, which is quite different. And I think once people just shifted their perspective on the story, they're suddenly like, wait up, Tracy is actually, and this is this is the part where it gets morally interesting for me. I think people were very comfortable saying Tracy is the victim of these teachers. And I think you could say that now, and I think we're very comfortable saying it now. It was complicated by the fact that Tracy herself was very resistant to being seen as a victim. Part of that was there was a certain kind of feminism that Tracy was tapping into that was about empowerment and confidence and about agency. And as a young girl, she's coming from nowhere, but she wants to go far in the world. She wants a story that makes her feel powerful. And the idea that she was taken advantage of by a teacher is not a story that I think she wants to tell about herself, and she really resists it in a kind of defiant way. And Tracy Flick Can't Win kind of starts with Tracy reading Me Too stories in the newspaper and thinking about her own experience and wondering if she needs to revise her thinking about what happened to her then. Because I don't even think that phrase of what happened, I think she's very confident or comfortable saying what I did rather than what was done to me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because A.O. Scott in the New York Times, sort of turned the tables on this whole thing and said Tracy is actually the hero of the movie Election and Matthew Broderick's the villain. But I really don't subscribe to that. I think that really they're both very human characters, and I think that's what's great about that movie and the novel is that you can really see all sides of the situation. I mean, certainly Tracy is overdue to reevaluate what, that incident that she was involved with that happened to her. But I think that it's too easy to say, heroes and villains. And I in fact think that Alexander in his direction of the movie kind of loved all these characters, Paul and Tammy and all of them. And it's a rich array. But, another thing I just wanted to bring up is the echoes of Election with the other characters in your book. I mean, Vito, Paul, you think of Paul and Vito to some degree, and you think of maybe Jack and, the principal in this story, and Mr. M in some ways. And it's funny, they're playing off each other in a very interesting way, I think.
Yeah, I think there are, a lot of high school types. And I think one of the reasons Tracy got remembered in a way is that she was a high school type that hadn't been identified before, of just this hard-charging young woman who thought that she could be elected president and wanted to run every club and answer every question because she felt like she had to be better than, all the boys to get where she needed to go. And yeah, I said before, Lily Chu is a little bit of a echo of Tracy, and Nate Cleary is also an echo of Paul. Mm-hmm. Vito is like a grown-up version of Paul, and Jack Wheat is almost more Mr. M grown up, I think.
Yeah, although then I think of Walt, the principal, and, as well. So it's all a kind of nice merging of everything. A couple other questions about the book, and then, we'll talk briefly about your career outside a novelist. But there's some incredible sequences in this book. I mean, the sequence of, Tracy meditating, where she is trying to meditate, but the failures of her life keep creeping into her thought as she's meditating, and it very elegantly turns into a whole flashback, bringing you up to date on what happened to her over these years. And you do that in several different places in the book. Jack's drive around town in the RV, and the recounting of his affair with Diane and all that. How do you construct these things? I mean, the flashback is a very powerful tool in this novel, and certainly if this becomes a movie, would be in the movie. But what are you thinking when you're constructing those sequences?
Well, so one of the reasons I think I really love this multiple first-person narrator thing is that what these characters always end up doing is sort of trying to convince themselves that they're good people. And I just love the way that people will, come up with narratives that preserve their sense of themselves. So Jack has had a long affair with the school secretary. He's the principal who's retiring, and he's driving around town, thinking about it, and it starts off just with, you're right, Jack's driving, Tracy's meditating. Tracy's meditating, by the way, because she has high blood pressure, which wouldn't be a surprise to anybody who has seen Election, And even in Election, I went back, I reread the book, and I was struck that I was very attentive to Tracy's various physical ailments. She has the ailments of somebody who is under permanent state of stress, right? She's just spends every night like not being able to sleep. Her stomach hurts. She's just worried all the time. And now she's 40 years old, even though she's a dedicated long-distance runner. She finds out that she has hypertension, and she doesn't want to start taking pills for her blood pressure, so she starts to meditate. And it seems very unlikely, that Tracy will achieve a state of calm but she tries, and it actually goes back to that scene in the movie, right, where she's like, "No, I'm not mad," And she's like,
she's kind of, I thought there's that great X song, "I must not think bad thoughts," and I kept thinking about that, and because she's trying so hard to meditate in this, but it just, I'm a failure, keeps creeping in. How did this happen to me?
Yeah, well, I remember. And it doesn't go away. Like, I have a book out now, and so it's like a very stressful period. And I wake up in the morning, and I don't know. I don't want to get into my own ailments, but
please.
No. It's just this. Sometimes you can't. I mean, everybody knows this. Sometimes you can't turn off the thoughts you would love to turn off. And, some people turn them off by drinking or eating a gummy, and some people turn them off by, lifting really heavy weights, and some people meditate them away. And it is interesting to watch, Tracy, of all people, try to do this. And she does say, like, sometimes it works. Sometimes there's this other voice that enters her consciousness that is gentler and more forgiving. And I think part of, the story of this book is to see a middle-aged Tracy trying to find some way to live with herself and some voice that allows her to forgive herself.
Yeah, well, the last question about the book, there's a really interesting character, Marissa, in there that is married to Kyle, and that's a whole story, but she becomes Tracy's friend, and I mean, I couldn't help but feel, and other people have said this as well to me, there's a hint of something more. She, really is very aggressive in trying to reach out to Tracy, and Tracy demurs through much of the movie.
The movie?
But, the movie, yes, I'm sorry.
It's not a movie yet, Albert.
I can be forgiven.
There's a
film
script
producer.
over here.
Yeah. Thank you for catching that. But anyway, did you ever consider, I really wanted more of Marissa in this book.
Well, okay, yeah. I know what you're saying, and it was actually, I was really happy about this. I often, your characters have to desire something in a novel, and almost all the time for me, desire is manifest as sexual desire. Mm-hmm. But what I really like about Tracy is that she is not a character motivated by sexual desire. At the beginning of the book, she has like a kind of, she has a sort of a boyfriend, but he's not very exciting to her. In fact, she's irritated by him. And I kept thinking, like, oh, I've got to give her like a romantic life. Like, and I just found that she was resisting it. And that it actually did occur to me at one point. Like, Tracy doesn't need a lover. Tracy needs a friend. And I think that is also part of this story of how does Tracy find a life she can live with. Mm-hmm. That's the thing she needs first.
Yeah, well, it's a very exciting journey that you take the reader on to get there, and everybody will get to experience that when they read it. But just for the last couple minutes before we turn to Q&A, I want to talk about your work as a screenwriter and as a television writer and as a showrunner, often with your own material. Ron and I have worked with you on countless projects. I think really everything except Mrs. Fletcher that you've written by and large. And, it's a very interesting thing because many novelists that we know, the last thing in the world they want to do is think about what happens beyond their novel. It's I'm done with it and here it is and do what you will. And, you seem to enjoy the what's next process, and you never seem overly protective of your work. You seem excited about the various collaborations that you have with directors, producers, whatever. Can you talk about, your feelings about carrying your own work forward and all that?
Yeah, I will say this. I think there's partly just an element of luck in this. Though luck being that you and Ron and Alexander and Jim and that amazing cast made a great movie. So this is my first experience with a film is Election. This is a book but when I sent it to you, it was unpublished and didn't look like it was ever going to get published.
Because people thought it was somehow trapped between being a YA novel.
Yeah, it kind of fell in the
literary
cracks of publishing in the early 90s. And so I send you this novel that I think of, I'm proud of it, but I also on some other level think it's a failure because it doesn't look like it's going to get published. And then, in record time, right, you find a director, the director and his partner write an amazing script and, big stars are in it. But more importantly, when I saw it in the theater for the first time, I was just like, this is like the best movie I've seen this year. It just was like, I was just so thrilled by it. It was, was more than anyone could hope for. And I talked to a bunch of novelists at that point. I had gone to a creative writing program. I was living in New York. Most writers have problems with the adaptations of their work. But I didn't. I felt like, if anything, this movie had improved on my book in some sense. And it also entered the cultural conversation in a way that, my book would never have on its own. So I think that became like a sort of revelation to me of like, okay, if you want your stories to, actually get people talking and spark a cultural conversation, film and TV, those are the kind of the ways to do it. And then there was an economic component, which was I was an adjunct composition teacher, and I was was making like $25,000 a year, and after election came out, the WB network offered me a 2 pilot deal that paid like 3 times what I was so it wasn't like get rich money, but it was like 3 times what I made for teaching college classes. And so I said, I'll do that.
Yeah.
So I started to like learn the craft of screenwriting, and then I decided I wanted to be more involved. And luckily, when we did Little Children, Todd Field was happy to collaborate with me, and I think he made a great movie of Little Children. And then TV was suddenly happening, and so then The Leftovers got made, and that was a whole other thing, right? Because the screenwriter in a feature film has a limited role. And I mean, I had no role at all in Election. I had a co-screenwriting thing on Little Children, but once that was done, I wasn't on set and I wasn't in the editing room. But when you're an executive producer on a TV show, you're in the writer's room and you're involved with casting and just really kind of overseeing the whole thing. And that was, that was really exciting for me. In The Leftovers, Damon Lindelof was the showrunner, and he's a very interesting storyteller and very different from me. And so that story of that was, how do we learn to work together and bring these two visions that are quite different together. And I think, that's part of what gives that show its unique palette. It's really wild in some ways, but it's also like very grounded in others. But that, I can't say that was easy exactly. But it was a story of the first season being, we butted heads a lot, and then sort of slowly learned to trust each other more over those years.
Well, of course, as a novelist, you have the luxury of being by yourself, but, when you get into these dynamics as, co-screenwriter or involved with the running of a show and everything, you're involved with a lot of different voices.
Yeah, and sometimes that makes you tear your hair out, right? I mean, if you don't agree with those different voices. On the other hand, I think I've been very lucky in my collaborators, and have just worked with a lot of people who've made things better. So I would never like take that position of like my version of this story is the only way to tell this story, because I've seen in the real world that my stories get transformed in ways that I really appreciate. And what's so fun about something like Tracy Flick Can't Win is that if I see it as an ongoing process, then I can actually react to those transformations. I mean, there was some element, I think, in this book of me wanting to reclaim Tracy a little bit.
Yeah.
To say, okay, she has been used in a particular way in the public, that turns her into a caricature or an archetype. But, I don't, if I'm writing a character, that I want that character to be as real and as human and as nuanced as possible. So to do a deep dive on middle-aged Tracy and to say, well, you might think that she would be a CEO or she might be a congresswoman. No, she has had some hard knocks in her life, and she got back up, and she built herself a respectable career as an assistant principal in a high school. And this part of the book is to tell you, how did that happen and how does she feel about it? And I think a lot of people bristle because they have this idea that that character was so talented and so smart and so driven that, of course, she would get to the top. But
well, it's a great surprise that you pulled that it hasn't worked out the way she wanted it. And it reminds you of, the Rabbit trilogy, Rabbit Angstrom and Updike and all that, and be exciting to see if the saga continues. But we're going to go to questions, but I just have to say that I think I speak for Ron that, we really value our collaboration with you, and Election is really, for us, the movie that was the most meaningful, and just the experience of not only getting involved with you very early, in your, at the time, unpublished manuscript, but seeing that through the studio system and the incredible job Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor and Reese and Matthew. I mean, Matthew was amazing. Yeah. But anyway, thank you, and
thank you.
And hopefully the story keeps going on. But now we turn it over to all of you for questions, if anybody.
Yes, we'll be going around the audience with microphones. Just a reminder to please keep your mask on when you're asking a question.
There is somebody there.
We'll go first here and then next over here. Hi.
Hi. With talking about the screenwriting and the other stuff, when you're writing a novel now, do you think about whether it's going to be adapted for a movie or a television series or anything like that?
I try not to, and I think, as Albert mentioned earlier, I don't have a real plan when I start a book, and I'm just kind of feeling my way through it. And so it just seems like a level that's just not going to help me if I'm trying to think like what happens next in the story. I kind of want to have a tunnel vision about that and not be trying to think beyond, the next few pages and the next few sentences. So, but the deeper answer, I think, is that being a screenwriter can often be frustrating because there are certain things that are really hard to do in a script. So moving in time can be really hard. Like I can do a flashback so easily in fiction, and also just getting at like an inner monologue can be really hard. I mean, one of the reasons Election's such a great movie is that it does have these soliloquies, this voiceover, soliloquy. But in general, it's not that easy in scripts to do it. And so I feel like when I'm writing fiction, I want to avail myself of those tools that are really the fiction writer's tools. So I feel like my books have actually gotten a little more literary after I became a screenwriter, because I was more like clearly aware of the differences in the two forms, and wanted to like take full advantage of all the tools in the fiction writer's toolbox.
Hi, would you mind talking about what you were thinking when you wrote The Leftovers?
What was I thinking? Well, I think I know what you mean there. There's always the thing you're thinking about consciously, which is important, and then even more important is the stuff that you're accessing unconsciously. So I started The Leftovers. after writing The Abstinence Teacher, which is a book that has an evangelical Christian character, and I'm not an evangelical Christian, and so to write that character, I had to do a deep dive into, evangelical Christian theology and practice, and got very interested in the idea of the rapture. I grew up Catholic, and the rapture was not part of Catholic theology. And, there's just this whole, story that a lot of Americans believe, which is, this rapture is going to happen, and there's going to be 7 years of tribulation. And I remember having this just weird feeling of like, you know what? If the tribulation happens, like, I don't want any part of it. I'm just going to live my life the way that I was living it before, because this story isn't my story, and I don't want to have to. I think that's one of the scary things about, any kind of political upheaval. Is just you have to, your story gets interrupted by somebody else's story, so I just had this image of people just, sitting around having a barbecue during the tribulation, and just trying to like shut it out of their minds. And that was where I started, but then as soon as I started I wanted it to be, I think, a satire. But as soon as I started to tell it, it was like, 3 years ago, all these people disappeared. And everybody, as soon as I tried to imagine the reality of that, all I wanted to tell about was who lost who and how they were dealing with it. I suddenly realized this is a book about grief. And it was only, I started it in maybe like 2008. And my father had died in 2002, and he died in a car accident. So he was here one day and then, gone that same day. And at a certain point, I just realized, I'm actually writing about that, how it felt to just have somebody, vanish from your life without being able to say goodbye. But I think that's what I mean. I was writing about the rapture from the outside, but I think it was accessing all these emotions that I had in me that I had not been able to deal with otherwise. Yeah.
There's somebody.
I wanted to hear what you thought of the January 6th hearings, but who do you think the most vivid characters are coming out of that, and where do you think the character narrative is in those hearings? It's so easy.
They're just everywhere. But today, because I think like Liz Cheney has become a really interesting figure. I thought Adam Kinzinger was amazing today, but this Jeffrey Clark guy, that guy is amazing. And I just love that. He was this close to being the Attorney General, and that moment when he's in there and the other guy, Donahue, says to him like, "We'll call you when there's an oil spill," But also just that the idea that they were all going to resign. That whole scene was just mind blowing. I kind of was aware of it before, but also this guy Clark, would keep getting scolded by his bosses and say that he was going to drop this whole thing, but then he'd just come back again and again with it, and he really thought that he had pulled off his coup,
Yeah, although today there were some heroes that emerged. The whole Justice Department, they were going to walk out. That was reassuring in some small way. But
and then Clark's house got raided by...
Yeah, that was today, right?
Yeah. So, I would be amazed. Sadly, there is some chance that we'll get Trump again, but who would like... I know there will be just horrible people who would be in his administration, but it just seems like anybody with a modicum of decency and caution would stay the hell away.
Yeah, well, you'd hope, but anybody else here? There's somebody up here.
Hi, Tom. I work with you on Leftovers. But I had a question. I haven't read the book yet, obviously, but I was curious about this. Obviously, now we're having the January 6th hearing, but the actual election was before you wrote that, and did that maybe draw Tracy Flick out? Just because of, like you said, the end of the Clinton era and like how that sort of played into it?
Yeah, what's funny is that I think I was, like everybody probably I could not, that whole era of Trump, is like a little bit sick, and I mean, even today during those hearings when they showed him, it almost, I felt like I was having some nightmare, because it seemed like a Kubrick movie or something. Like imagine the worst American president you could imagine. Like here it is. But weirdly, in this book, which takes place in 2018, because I needed school to be in session, and it's pre-pandemic. Yeah. Trump is the president. But I didn't even decide. I just never mentioned him. Mike Pence gets a mention, and he's by far the superior person of the two. But yeah, Trump does not get mentioned, which I feel like is definitely like a total failure of realism. Mm-hmm. But it just felt like to let him in the book was wrong. I know Albert used to say he thought that Kayleigh McEnany had some Tracy-ish qualities, and I understood that.
Yeah, I thought she would become a conservative person on CNN or one of those talking heads, yeah. But I think you came up with them.
Kellyanne Conway has some Tracy in her, I think. But I personally feel like Tracy so resents these guys who just get everything handed to them. Trump being like the prime example of this kind of guy. I don't think Tracy could make that step. That would be one step too far. I think she's ambitious and ideologically flexible, and she does say when she was in law school, like I wanted to be a tough on crime prosecutor. Like Tracy likes rules, and she likes the idea that people would get punished if they do wrong. So I think she does have some like politically conservative leanings, but I don't think she could have gone in for Trump.
Good point. Yeah, that's true. Anybody else? Oh, there's somebody.
Just wondering if you have any comments about the bookmaking process, your relationship with your editor, or how you feel about the artwork, or any of those fun book world details.
Oh yeah, well, I do. So this book has this cover. It's Tracy with her head in her hands, and the title is Tracy Flick Can't Win. Well, I'd started. There's a file on my computer. It's called Hall of Fame, and so that was the working title of this book for a long time. And I every time I tried to describe it, people said, "It's about this high school, and they're starting a Hall of Fame, but Tracy Flick is in it." And then I did it so many times, I thought, no, I just have to put Tracy Flick in the title. And then I tried to call it Tracy Flick and the Hall of Fame, and my publisher didn't like it for some reason. They never explained it. They just said no. And so then I came up with Tracy Flick Can't Win, because there's a point in the story where she sort of uses that phrase, but also because it echoed, I think, that sense that a lot of people had about Hillary Clinton. That was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that was part. I was working with a new editor on this book, and that's always a tricky thing for for a writer because you haven't worked out a language. Because I think good editors probably approach different writers in different ways. But my editor was so, she had a very light touch, but I started to feel like she had almost like a very unerring ear. So I wanted the book to really flow. Like, I think it's a book you could read probably in a couple of sittings. And she was really good at spotting like bumps in it. And instead of trying to like solve the bump, what I often ended up doing was whatever scene she flagged, I would just take the whole scene out. And I ended up just cutting like a third of the book to get it to the point where it is now, where it really flows. And it was I felt like she had done something very subtle, which was never to like, she never would say, why don't you do this? It would just be like, something's wrong here, something's wrong here. So that's all she was doing, was just like making little marks where she felt like something bumped her, and then just left it to me. And for some reason, you know, I almost took it as like, oh, this scene is infected. let me just cut it out. And it turned out to be, I think, a pretty, I'd never cut like that before, and it was, I thought it worked pretty well.
We have time for one more.
Yeah.
There's somebody.
A question about the realization about what The Leftovers was really about. When does that revelation come? And I guess I'm interested because I do a lot of pre-writing before I can really write the thing, and I think that's when I figure it out, or that's when it works best for me. So when does that happen for you? Does it influence the writing? Does it inform what you are writing, or how does that happen?
So there's a famous Flannery O'Connor quote where she says, it actually is an advantage for a fiction writer to be a little stupid. So I often discover things like after I've written the book. And I don't think that's terrible, you know, because in some level you want to turn off your critical brain for as long as you can, and try and let some more emotional or artistic brain do it. And I feel like if you figure it out too soon, you might lose interest. So I try to leave certain things open. It was more, with The Leftovers, it was more just like, you know, that the kind of feeling that you get when you're writing and you go like, oh, I thought this was going to be a funny book, but every day I feel terrible. It's not funny. And then like, why is that? But you know, but for a long time I'm just going like, this is a really heavy book. I wish I'd never started this book. I can't. I wish I was like Dostoevsky and kept a writer's journal, and I could tell you on February 3rd that I figured it out. But I have a feeling it was like after I wrote the book. That's when I was like, I think my, you know, the publisher's like, okay, you should write like a little essay, and we'll try and, you know, publish it somewhere just as part of the publicity launch. And then I think that's when I started to have to kind of think rationally about why I did certain things.
Oh,
Yep, there's one more.
One more, if we could. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering how the two of you met, since obviously you knew him well enough to send an unpublished manuscript. And then also, if you could talk a little bit about your day, if there's like a ritualized writing time, or if it just depends on where you're on the project.
Yeah, I'll do the second part, you do the first part.
Yeah, well, we met because an old friend of my partner, Ron Yerkes, a woman named Janice Shapiro, and she's a friend of mine too, told us that she had met Tom at a writer's colony where he was working on a book called The Wishbones, And Janice thought it was a book that we would be interested in as film producers. And she suggested that we read his collection of short stories, Bad Haircut, and then reach out to him. And so we read Bad Haircut. We called Tom, and he said, well, you know, I'm still working on the Wishbones, but I do have this unpublished manuscript, Election, and he described the book. And he said he was having trouble because, as I said before, it was somewhere between a literary novel and a YA novel. And would we be interested? And Ron and I read it and, you know, really flipped for it. And then we had a meeting a couple weeks later at MTV Films, and they loved the idea, and the project got set up at Paramount, and we became very good friends at that point. And then, you know, as I said, have collaborated on many, many projects since.
Yeah, Albert actually found the letter,
Yeah.
the cover letter that I sent with Election. So
Yeah, it was kind of a great letter because it was very funny. It was the first time we met was on this phone call, and he sent us the novel Election with this letter, and he said, and I'll let you know when Bad Haircut is out of option. And then Tom said, well, it was never an option. Like, he was obviously trying to protect himself in some little way.
I don't know. I can't remember if anybody optioned it, but maybe there was.
Yeah,
I
but
don't
it turned out.
I don't think I was that sneaky at that age.
No, well, who knows? We didn't know each other, but it all turned out beautifully with Election.
Yeah. So and the second part was. Oh. Yeah, no, I think the only way to write a novel is in a very routine way. In fact, I'm always really fascinated with like the Graham Greens and the Trollops who would give themselves quotas, you know, and Graham Greene would apparently, when he hit that word 500, he would just put the pen down and go get a drink. But, you know, I think, so for me, I'm generally, you know, morning into the early afternoon writer. I try to be especially easy on myself, like for the first 6 months when I'm writing a novel, because I know I don't know what's happening. So if I'm just sitting there and, you know, hating everything, I'll just get out and go for a bike ride or just go for a walk. Just try to do something to spare me the misery of that, because I just know it's like built into the process. And then eventually I'll get a critical mass of work, and then I can sit for longer. And then when it's really happening, I'll be like waking up in the middle of the night and writing notes. But you can't force that stuff. It's just really a slow accretion of knowledge about the project, and a sense of the story. So I have learned to be patient with myself, but just because I know I can't force it. I've never been able to do that. But if I live with it for long enough, something will happen.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you both a lot. I appreciate all of this. And thank you guys for all being here. And on Monday, we have a Lost and Found at 7:30. And then we have Jessica Salgado coming on Wednesday for a bilingual program. So thank you all. And Tom will be signing in the lobby behind the desk. Thank you.